And I'd like to welcome all of you to the Atlantic Council for this incredibly timely event on Mexico's energy reform, which was passed by the Mexican Congress last Thursday and declared constitutional just yesterday after being approved by a majority of state legislatures. I would like to recognize how pleased and honored we are that Mexican Ambassador Eduardo Medina Mora is with us today. The U.S. is lucky to have Ambassador Medina Mora in Washington, and the Atlantic Council is lucky that the ambassador is a friend of the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming. As well, we are delighted that Mexico's Undersecretary of Hydrocarbons, Enrique Ochoa, traveled to Washington for this event and report launch, and also did so on very minimal sleep after working tirelessly to get the reform passed through Congress in the last few weeks. We'd also like to welcome the many guests who are here, the permanent observers of the OAS, members of the International Trade Commission, Atlantic Council members, friends of the Atlantic Council, as well as all of those are here for their first event. And I'd also like to especially welcome those as well joining us remotely via webcast and those tuning in via C-SPAN to our event. We are also delighted to have many members of the Mexican press here, and we have arranged a special post-event briefing for them and for other members of the press. So I ask that they hold their questions for that opportunity, give questions for folks, non-members of the press to ask questions during this event. So bienvenido to the Atlantic Council. I'd also like to thank all those who helped make the launch of this report a success, the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center team, Mihaela Karsti and the Energy and Environment Program, and the Atlantic Council's fabulous external relations team. The Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center began operations in October, and we are off to a running start. Our center was started with the generous support of philanthropist and business leader Adrienne Arsht, and to do specifically what we are doing today, which is to broaden awareness of the many transformations across Latin America and to change the nature of the discussions about the region and to highlight Latin America's potential as a strategic and economic partner for Europe, the United States, and beyond. And we couldn't think of a better first report of the Arsht Center than what we are releasing today. Energy reform in Mexico is precisely the type of transformation that shows the new dynamism in Mexico and reflects the changes being seen across Latin America. An editorial this week in the Washington Post says it, quote, opens the door for a Mexican economic takeoff. Our report in today's event reflects the philosophy of our new center, which is to be dynamic, timely in analysis, and succinct yet rigorous. This morning, Undersecretary Ochoa will speak for about 15 minutes. He has then graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience that will be managed by Adrienne Arsht Center Director Peter Schechter. After that, David Goldwyn, author of the Council's new report being launched today, Mexico Rising: Comprehensive Energy Reform at Last. He will spend about 10 minutes to give an overview of his findings in the report that all of you should have. And for those tuning in via webcast, has now been made live on our site as of 8:30 this morning. David and Undersecretary Ochoa will then join Duncan Wood and Jorge Piñón in a conversation moderated by Peter Schechter. And don't worry, there will be lots of time for audience questions and Q&A. And we'll also be taking questions via Twitter from members of our webcast audience, as well as those tuning in via C-SPAN. And if you want to live tweet the event, if you want to get out your phones during the event, as long as you're not checking your own email, you can live tweet at @ACLATAM is our handle, and join the conversation using hashtag #MXENReform. It's all on the agenda you got. So we are joined by a very impressive group of speakers this morning. You have their full bio, so I'll not read each one. But briefly, Duncan Wood is the director of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Duncan is both a Mexico and an energy expert, and is one of the foremost thinkers here in Washington on Mexico issues in the think tank community. We're so excited Duncan can be with us today. Jorge Piñón is the director of the Center for International Energy and Environment Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. Beyond his many years in the energy industry, Jorge now leads a truly unique interdisciplinary center at UT Austin that combines geology, business, and policy, and is really taking UT Austin onto the next frontier on energy issues. Of course, David Goldwyn is now I'll call David Goldwyn an Atlantic Council author, and he is also president of Goldwyn Global Strategies. He is an energy guru, essentially a black belt third degree in the energy world, with an incredibly nuanced understanding of the energy industry that is reflected in his excellent report. You'll see in his bio, he has had multiple government positions, including special envoy positions and a variety of other high-level energy posts. We are especially pleased to welcome Undersecretary of Hydrocarbons, Enrique Ochoa. Undersecretary Ochoa is really the man of the moment. He has not slept in probably weeks. Hopefully you got to sleep a little bit on the plane ride from Mexico. And he is the point person on many of the issues of the reform. So there couldn't be a better person from Mexico to travel from Mexico to join us and talk about the reform than Undersecretary Ochoa. He has worked tirelessly over the last few weeks to secure passage in Congress. And he did so by combining his unique and important knowledge of energy and his incredible understanding of business and his intersection with policy. Undersecretary Ochoa, we are so thankful that you agreed to come on a plane and come to Washington, that you endured our customs here to get into the country, and to discuss the reform at such a busy time. Christmas is right around the corner, and we're so happy that you traveled to Washington right before the Christmas holiday. So everyone, we're excited for a great program today, and please join me first in welcoming Undersecretary Ochoa, who will give 15 minutes of remarks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can speak from the podium, or you can speak from.
Good morning. On behalf of Secretary Pedro Joaquín Codwell, it is an honor for me to be here and speak to you so close to Christmas and yet so far away from home. So it shows that I haven't slept. I'm sorry, I thought that my mascara had worked. It obviously hasn't. But I want to thank Ambassador Medina Mora for being here with us. And when Peter first asked me to come here, I thought it was such an honor. So I'm glad that I am here. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation to help see some of the figures that will allow us to explain how did we got here, how did we got to a reform, and then where are we now with the constitutional reform and the transitory articles that were also put in place, and what's next. So somebody's going to help me with the presentation? Okay. So what we have here is the history of Mexico's recent oil production decline. As you can see, we reached a high point in 2004 with 3.4 million barrels per day. And since then, we have decreased almost by 1 million barrels per day in the last 8 years. So that has been a huge concern for Mexico. We have done so in a time where we have more than tripled our investment in exploration and extraction of oil and gas. So we have put the money into the fields, but we have come out short with the oil production. We haven't felt that too much in our budget in Mexico because at the same time, the oil prices have tripled. As you can see, in 2004, they were at $31 per barrel. Now they are around $100 per barrel. So as our production of oil declined, the international prices increased. Therefore, in our Mexican economy, we didn't felt that economic impact of such a low decrease in production. But of course, this is a problem. Next, please. Well, this is natural gas, and the history of the last 15 years is not much better than oil production. As you can see, the green line is the consumption of natural gas in Mexico, a lot of consumption into industry and to power generation. And the blue line is our internal production of natural gas. And as you can see, in 1997, we were autosufficient in natural gas. We produced the same amount of gas that we were consuming. But things have changed in the last 15 years, and now we are importing, mostly from the US, a third of our consumption. So despite having enormous quantity of natural gas underneath our Mexican soil, we have the irony of not being able to produce as much as we should, and we're importing a third. The next, please. In gasoline, the history is very similar to the past two slides, but even worse. We are importing half of our gasoline products. So despite of being a strong producer of oil and having important refineries in the country, we have not been able to keep on to the pace of the growth of our economy. So we're bringing from the US mostly 50% of our consumption of gasoline. The next, and this is the last sector within the hydrocarbons, which are petrochemicals. And this story is very similar, but even worse than the past. So now what we see here is that we're importing 65% of our petrochemicals. So in 4 slides, what you can see is in the last 15 years, we have had a strong decrease in oil production. We have had a decrease in natural gas production. Therefore, we are importing more natural gas. We are importing 50% of our consumption of gasoline, and we are importing 65% of our petrochemicals. So that doesn't seem to be the story of a strong hydrocarbons producing country. So we needed a reform. We were going into the path of becoming a net importer of primary energy products rather than a strong exporter that we have been for decades. So the next, please. So what we see here is that for the first time since 1960, the Mexican oil and gas model embedded in Article 27 of our Constitution was amended. Let me put into place this in context. The reform that happened in 1960, 53 years ago, was made to close even more the sector, to not to allow private participation in most of it. So it is really a very transformative reform that President Enrique Peña has put through the Mexican Congress, and we have to acknowledge that Mexican Congress passed this constitutional amendment by over 2/3 of its members present in both houses. And as you know, and Jason was telling us in his kind introduction, the Mexican state legislators also passed the reform, and just yesterday it was enacted by the Mexican Federal Congress that the state legislators have approved it. So now we are up for the phase where President Enrique Peña Nieto shall sign the reform, make it public, and then we start the nice process of implementation. Next one, please. So now let's see how the reform has put the new model. So now oil and gas reserves are going to be administered by the Mexican state through the Ministry of Energy. In the past, there was kind of a confusion because these parts of the reserves were administered by Pemex. Now they're going to be run by the Ministry of Energy. Now, exploration and extraction, which remain a strategic element of the Constitution reserved to the state, are going to be done through contracts, which were previously prohibited in the Constitution. Article 27 was amended to allow contracts which are common in the global market. We're going to have service contracts, profit-sharing contracts, production-sharing contracts, and licenses. So this is a very strong transformation in our constitutional framework, allowing contracts which are common in the world, but were absent in Mexico's legal framework. In exploration and extraction, we're going to do something that has also happened in other countries that have had this type of transformation, which is a round zero that's going to allow Pemex to have some entitlements that will allow them to start off the implementation of the reform. I'm going to talk more about that in a few seconds. Refinery and petrochemistry, which were closed to private participation, are going to be now open. And you can participate in refineries and in petrochemicals with Mexican or foreign companies associated between them or associated with Pemex. Pemex can also participate in these sectors, but will not be the only participator, which had been up to now in the Constitution. And in transportation, storage, distribution, and commercialization, we're also opening it up for private participation. Most of those sectors were closed only for public participation. Now it can be also done by privates. Next, please. So what will be the round zero for Pemex? In the transitory articles of the constitutional reform, Congress has established a path which includes that Pemex has up to 90 days after the constitutional amendment has been published by the president to present to the Ministry of Energy those areas in the country where they want to keep on working. And they have 90 days to present the technical elements that will allow the Ministry of Energy and the Hydrocarbons National Commission to decide on a technical basis which will be the fields that Pemex will keep for them to work on. And the Ministry of Energy will have 180 days after those first 90 days to decide that. That will be the round zero. Now, Pemex will maintain exploration entitlement in those areas where it has made some commercial discoveries or exploration investments, and we will allow them a period between 3 and 5 years to do so. In those fields where Pemex is already extracting oil or gas, they will keep those entitlements for the next rounds. Pemex may propose the Ministry of Energy to transit from the entitlements that they're going to achieve in round zero to the new contracts that are going to be into place through secondary legislation. And that process will have to go through a mechanism that I'll show now that includes the National Hydrocarbons Commission. This is common international practice for those of you who have seen these models work elsewhere, like in Colombia or Brazil. Next, please. Well, this is a slide that I like to show very much in Mexico, which is the 20 most important countries that produce oil. And what you could see is that all of them had in their legal frameworks either concessions, profit-sharing contracts, production-sharing contracts, or licenses to work with the private sector. That was the common practice. But there were two exceptions in that area. In these 20 countries, only Mexico and Kuwait had service contracts. No other type of contracts were allowed. And that had hurt Mexico in an important way. Now with the reform, as you can see in number 10, now we not only have service contracts, we also have profit, production, sharing, and licenses. So we are now in a group of those countries that have a legal framework that allow them to make a better use of its natural resources. Next. Now this is very important. The natural resources, oil and gas, that are in the subsoil remain owned by the nation. And this is also a very important constitutional fact. But we are allowing contracts that allow, once the oil and gas are extracted above the subsoil, to be part of the private sector. So how will that new system work? According to the transitional articles in the Constitution, the Ministry of Energy will have to select the blocks that are going to be open for participation with the technical assistance of the National Hydrocarbons Commission. Once we allow or we select a block, then the Ministry of Energy decides the technical guidelines of the bidding rounds and the technical design of the contract. Meantime, the Minister of Finance will design the fiscal terms of the contract. The National Hydrocarbons Commission then conducts the bidding rounds, decides on the winning bids, and on behalf of the Mexican state signs the contract. When the contract is being put into work, on a yearly basis, the National Hydrocarbon Commission has the responsibility of the technical management of those contracts. We follow how those contracts are being implemented. The money that comes out from those contracts goes to a Mexican Petroleum Fund for Stabilization and Development that is going to be based in the central bank. This is similar to the model in Norway, as most of you know. And I'm going to explain how that fund works. Next, please. This is the Mexican Petroleum Fund for Stabilization and Development. This is one of I believe, the strongest parts of the reform. And it's established in the constitutional article 28 and also in transitory articles 14 and 15. What we have is a committee headed by the Minister of Finance, who is the chairman. The energy minister participates, and the central bank governor participates. And there will be 4 independent members nominated by the Mexican president, but ratified by a 2/3 majority of the Mexican Senate. That's going to be the committee that's going to run the fund, and the fund will be based in the central bank. Now, when the money comes in, the first thing that this fund will do is pay the contractors. So if it's a profit sharing or it's a production sharing contract that establishes costs for the producer, the fund pays them first. Secondly, the fund submits to the federal budget up to 4.7% of GDP. That is the base that right now the oil sector submits to the budget. That's the number in 2013. So what we are guaranteeing in the Mexican future is that that base of the budget coming from oil will remain constant in a way that it will stabilize our finances. We will go in a transitional period that the Mexican finances will not be suffering from lack of money. So we have a constant of 4.7%. After we reach that 4.7%, the rest of the money goes into long-term savings. And that reached up to 3% of GDP. Once we reach 3% of GDP, we have that in the bank. Then if we assume that there's another dollar that comes additional to these first two elements, it's divided in the following way. At least 40% of that new dollar goes again to the savings account. That means we increase the savings account until it reaches from 3% of the GDP up to 10% of the GDP. Every year we give at least 40 cents of each additional dollar back to savings, to long-term savings. This is very important because we're thinking about the future of the country. Once we achieve that, the next element is that up to 10% of the additional dollar will go to the universal pension system. As you know, Mexico is debating in Congress the creation of a universal pension system. This will fund that pension system. The next 10% goes to science and technology and renewable energy projects. The next 30% goes to oil and gas project investments through a vehicle that it got inspired in Petoro, in the model in Norway, where you have an external fund managed by the Ministry of Energy, where you can put a financial take in some projects that seem to be very promising. And up to 10% goes to scholarships, connective enhancement projects, and regional industry development. So the idea of this fund is that the money that comes through the Mexican oil and gas reform, goes mostly to long-term projects. So we establish a base for the budget that will allow us not to have any hiccups. But on the same time, and most importantly of that, we are betting on the future of the country. Next, please. Transparency is one of the most important elements of this reform. I haven't found a Mexican that has been satisfied with the way transparency has worked so far in the oil industry in our country. So we need to have a new mechanism to do it better. And the constitutional amendment goes to that in transitory articles 9 and 21. So first, we're going to make the bidding rounds and their guidelines will be made public. So anybody can see it. Second, transparency clauses will be included in oil and gas contracts. In every oil and gas contracts, we will have a transparency clause so that citizens of Mexico and of the world can check it online or ask for those information through the transparency institution. Third, there will be full disclosure of all payments associated to oil and gas contracts. As I have described before, the money goes to the fund, and the fund pays contractors for their costs. Well, those transactions shall be made public as well. And fourth, external audits to supervise cost recovery and accounting aspects. And this is very important. The funding itself is going to be public, transparent, and auditable. So we believe that we are establishing at the constitutional level, we're establishing 4 elements of best practices for transparency. In addition to that, there is a transitory article that allows Congress to establish special legislation against corruption. And that is something also we need to tackle first. Next, please. Well, these have been the main elements of the energy reform. I'm sure you have many questions through which I will learn a lot, and I'm looking forward for that opportunity. And as you also know, the transitory articles establish the guidelines looking forward. It's up to 120 days for secondary legislation, implementing legislation, which we believe will go through in the next process of Congress, which will be between February the 1st and April the 30th. Many of those elements will be fixed by Congress, and I just hope that you will invite me again on April so that we can have another conversation once that legislation is approved. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Give us 15 minutes for questions. Muchas gracias. Again, my welcome to everybody. I'm going to do something which my colleagues know I rarely do, which is to stay silent. And I'd like to open up just for 15 minutes to a couple of questions from the floor for the Undersecretary. Sir.
Yes, Bob Wright, U.S. Department of Energy. It's been my experience that Pemex has held their geological data very close to the vest. So my question is, will that be disclosed in general for all of Mexico, or will you have it remain for when you open up a particular area, that it will be available, and how will it be available?
Thank you, Bob. This is a very important question. The constitutional reform establishes that that information that Pemex has been able to collect through the years goes to the National Hydrocarbons Commission. And the objective of that is to be able to make it public once the areas have been selected by the Ministry of Energy. So once we are opening up an area for bidding, the main idea is that the National Hydrocarbons Commission will make public the information, the geological information that we have for that area. In addition to that, we're giving the Hydrocarbons Commission the responsibility to contract private sector or others, universities or so, to do seismic studies for most of the areas in Mexico that right now we only have two-dimension studies. So we need to increase the quality of the studies that we have of our subsoil due to technological advances, and that Pemex is a little bit behind on that. So first we collect the data into the National Hydrocarbons Commission. We open up the commission to be able to establish through contracts more information, and once we decide that an area will become available for competition, then we show the information.
Let me take somebody from here, please, sir.
Christian Gomez, excuse me, Christian Gomez from the Council of the Americas. Curious about the referendum that's being proposed by the PRD in 2015. Is there actually a realistic chance that this could stop the reform?
Thank you, Christian. I don't think so, but this is something that will be still debated in Mexico. As you know, there is still secondary legislation to be approved by Congress in order to regulate what we call a consulta popular, which has a different technological effects than different technical effects than a referendum, and the process has not been started yet. So in the Ministry of Energy, we will continue with the guideline that our constitutional reform has established, following the round zero and the enactment of secondary legislation in Congress.
But how will this get resolved in the end? Whether
we'll wait and see what happens with the legislation of that consulta popular, because right now it's not there yet.
Sir.
Hi, Jeff Epping with Energis LLC. Will there be an emphasis, or is it still too early, on the onshore versus the offshore, both of which have different potential, but tremendous potential? Onshore versus offshore.
Thank you. Well, Pemex Director Emilio Lozoya has said that in the round zero, he's very interested in keeping the onshore and the shallow waters that we call, offshore, but with a small distance. So we will see first what happens in round zero, what will be the requests from Pemex in the first 90 days. We will analyze them thoroughly in the next 6 months. And once that is approved, then Pemex can go into the process of changing those entitlements into contracts. And he has been public about the idea of looking for help in some of the, what we call campos maduros, mature fields or brownfields. And we will also be very open to see how Pemex transits from its original entitlements in shallow waters. But it seems to be the case that areas on deep water and ultra deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, or the shale gas or shale oil in the northern part that borders with Texas. These are the states of Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and the northern part of Veracruz. Seems to be the areas more promising for participation.
Please. Wait for the mic, please.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank you.
Reva Carruth, Georgetown University. The United States and Germany have embarked on a very ambitious plan for clean and renewable energy as part of the energy transformation process. Could you talk a little bit about your plan for energy efficiency and industry standards in that regard? Thanks.
Thank you very much. This has been a very important topic of discussion in Congress. Two of the transitory articles in the constitutional reform establish the responsibility of the Mexican state to come up with a plan, of a transition plan. And that plan is going to be the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy. What we see is that natural gas is a very important transitory fuel, transitory, that's right, it's a brief, because, and right now we have this big irony in the country that we have strong reserves of natural gas and we're still importing 1/3 of what we're consuming. And that also means that we would like to burn more natural gas to produce electricity in Mexico. But because we do not have a strong supply of natural gas right now, then we are burning fuel oil or diesel, and which is more polluting, but more importantly, it costs us over 4 times or up to 6 times more than if we will be burning natural gas. So for environmental reasons and for economic reasons, it is a bad policy that we're not producing enough natural gas in our country to produce more electricity. More importantly, if we produce more electricity with natural gas, we will be able to reduce the costs of electricity in Mexico, which are very high. We're on average, we're over 25%. We pay 25% more in electricity in Mexico than you guys pay in the US. And that's very bad for our business sector. So there's many reasons why we have to go to natural gas. In addition to that, a strong part of the money that's being collected in the fund will go to renewable energy. And the constitutional amendment establishes a particular responsibility for Congress that in the next 120 days, once the reform is published, it will also have to discuss specific legislation to push forward renewables in the country. Specific geothermal law has to be enacted because we have a strong potential to have more production of electricity through geothermals. And we need just a law because right now we have 26 different laws that have to do with that process, and there is not a very clear process how to get there. So you have to deal with different institutions, and every time you go to one step, it seems that you have left an institution behind. You have to go back. So it's just not right. And we have now the responsibility through the constitutional reform to do it better.
We'll take one more question. The gentleman in the aisle, and you, sir. Thank you. Wait for the mic, please.
Yes, I'm David Johansen with the U.S. International Trade Commission. It's been 20 years since NAFTA was implemented, and there's been much discussion on this anniversary both in the United States and in Mexico. Did the implementation of NAFTA lead to what is occurring now in Mexico, the opening of the energy sector to foreign investment? Thank you.
Thank you. I was very young when NAFTA was. I will say that obviously we're looking to 2 elements that go in the same direction. In the near term, as I showed in the slides, we have had a decrease in production of oil, of gas, of gasoline, and of petrochemicals. So that created the need of the Mexican government, and President Peña Nieto took it, since he was a candidate, the responsibility to change the framework, the legal framework that we had. Secondly, of course, we're interested in having a better economic integration in a way that allows us to compete on a fair basis. And if our costs of gas and electricity are higher than those that are in the United States, we do not benefit Mexico, and we do not benefit the region. So we need to establish mechanisms to make the whole area competitive. And I think that this reform accomplishes both objectives.
Enrique, thank you very much for taking a couple of questions.
More questions.
Well, you will take a couple of more questions. So I
will be around, please, if there's other questions. I would really like to hear.
We will come back in a few minutes with a larger panel, but I'd like to ask David Goldwyn now to talk a little bit about his report and to frame for us the discussion that we'll have in the panel. Thank you very much. Why don't we sit down?
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary, let me say first thank you to the Atlantic Council, really for the privilege of being able to be part of this report. And I also want to thank 3 members of my team who were really indispensable, Neil Brown, Corey Gill, and Lee Hendricks, who made immeasurable contributions. I think the first finding that we make in this report is that you have to appreciate what a remarkable feat of political statecraft and statesmanship this reform is. Here in Washington, we pat ourselves on the back if we get bipartisan agreement to keep the government open for another few months. But in the course of a year, Mexico has, with the agreement of 3 parties that don't agree with each other much, done education reform, labor reform, fiscal reform, and now with 2 of the 3 major parties, energy reform. So it's really a formidable accomplishment, and it is really breathtaking in the scale of its ambition. If it succeeds, it will move Mexico from being a major to, by 2025, I think, a strategic supplier of oil, and it will revive its economy and I think be very positive for bilateral relations and for the hemisphere. I think you have to understand that these changes are permissive and directive in nature. The Constitution permits private investment into the upstream, midstream, and downstream, and it directs the legislature to create legislation and then regulators to create regulations. So now the hard work begins. It's really all about implementation and execution. And I think there are, for me, 5 major accomplishments of this reform that are worth pointing out. The first one, the most obvious one, is the introduction of private investment into all these 3 sectors. The second is that Mexico has separated energy policy from industry supervision, and this is classic best practice in regulation. So you have the Energy Ministry setting policy, and you have 5 new regulators in safety and environment managing the pipeline system that have to be stood up, but they will do the monitoring. So that is really quite best practice. Third is this new and very transparent petroleum fund, which very much like the Norwegian fund, has independent supervision, caps how much money will come out of the industry to the federal budget, and then directs all these other purposes. Fourth is transparency, and if implemented, the Mexican system will be among the most transparent, and transparent in that contracts will have a degree of public accessibility. Reports of funds and costs paid by the industry are directed to be transparent, as well as the fund itself. So that really is quite remarkable. And fifth is this commitment to sustainability, that it's directed, as Secretary Ochoa said, in 2 of the transitory articles, that both in the electricity system and in the hydrocarbon system, that there are supposed to be sustainability goals. My sense is that there are 3 major categories of commercial opportunities here. The first will involve Pemex, and these will be joint ventures with Pemex on what it calls its bitten apples. And these were fields that Pemex developed when they were high pressure, and then more or less abandoned as it moved on to the next high pressure field because it had to maintain production. So with some basic enhanced oil recovery and a good deal of capital, it's likely that Mexico can increase its production 300 to 400,000 barrels a day, much as we've seen Iraq do through basic conventional oil field services. Pemex believes it will keep the shallow onshore and keep Cantarell and KMZ for itself, but you never know what kind of trade offers they may get. The transitory articles in the Constitution indicate that reserves will be bookable, and they have taken every pains, short of saying book reserves, to say that the system is designed to allow companies to account for the future benefits of the contracts they're entering into. So I think these joint ventures with Pemex are the first area of opportunity, first on these bitten apples, second on the existing deep water fields where they have exploration, which will be part of their round 0 obligations, where they can bring in a joint venture. The second, I think, will be the seismic area, where there will be a need for 3D seismic, both for CNH and for companies. And third will be after the round 0, probably a year after legislation, the new deep water. And that's where you will see the greatest influx of purely private companies or partnerships with Pemex. We see 7 significant challenges for Mexico to overcome in accomplishing this reform. The first is managing expectations, because as people who know this industry know well, the ramp up is kind of slow, and it will take a couple of years to get all the regulators stood up. So there will be a gradual but not an exponential rise in investment, and I think managing expectations from the public will be important. Likewise, in the power sector, you're going to need to develop gas and then transport gas in order to substitute gas for fuel oil, so it's going to be a while before you see those results in the electricity sector. And this is what's really statesmanship about this, is this government has undertaken an initiative, and it's uncertain whether in the next 5 years they will see the lion's share of these benefits, but they did it anyway, and that's really admirable. The second challenge will be delivering competitive oil and gas exploration terms. There are a lot of hands in that pot. There's SENER doing policy, there's CNH on technical, there's the finance ministry on the terms. They got to work together, they got to move quick, and they got to be competitive, where we could be dealing in a world of $80 oil. So it's not clear how it will work, but for each of the terms, and also we need to find out when we'll figure out which scheme will apply to which form of acreage. Will it be a concession? Will it be profit sharing? Will it be production sharing? So that's a challenge. The third is building these effective regulators. 5 fantastic framework regulators, but you're going to need people, you're going to need rules, and you're going to need to move fast. And I think the bellwethers for me are whether Mexico outsources and brings in external help, external expertise to bridge the gap to where they train their own cohort of regulators. The fourth big question is the value proposition for the power sector. And that's where there's not as much detail in the power sector as there is in the hydrocarbon sector in the reform, but who will be able to invest? Will they be able to sell directly to customers? How and at what price? And price is a big issue. Electricity prices are subsidized and gasoline prices are subsidized, and subsidy reform dropped out of the reform. So how that takes place, how subsidies are dealt with, I think will affect the power sector reform as well. Fifth is what we call cutting the cord with Pemex, which is, well, the framework says 5 independent directors, 5 government directors, the minister decides, relatively autonomous. It's a new commercial public enterprise. It has more ability to plan on its own. How big is the dividend going to be? The government's still going to be relying on Pemex in the early years. Can they build capital? Can they plan? Can they put all the money in the upstream if they want rather than the downstream, if that's where they think the value is? This remains to be seen. The sixth is trusting the market. If it turns out that the best economic proposition is to import gasoline and import natural gas and develop oil, will that be okay for Pemex? Will that be, or will there be measures taken to direct where investment goes? And the seventh is local content. There's talk about the need for local content rules. What will they be? Will they be like Brazil? Will they be less onerous? The government has indicated that it has seen the challenges. It does not intend to follow the Brazilian model on domestic content, but that remains to be seen. So in terms of the opportunity, I think there are really 4 tremendous opportunities for Mexico here. First, in terms of BRICS, it's to be best in class. This is the government that can do structural reform. This is the government that can move quickly. So among all the other countries that are out there, if implemented well, this will really move Mexico to the head of the class, not just in energy, but in other areas where it will look like the country to invest in, close to market, but also able to deal with private investment. The second is prosperity. Obviously, if this works, you've got positives for balance of trade, for investment, for manufacturing, for job creation, for cheaper energy as that flows through the system. And I think in terms of energy investment, if this model works the way it's designed, Mexico will be in pole position in the hemisphere. If your choice is Brazil, Colombia is extremely competitive. If you've got Venezuela, if you've got Brazil, if you've got Ecuador, if you've got offshore, Suriname and Guyana, where do you want to be? And I think Mexico has the chance to be the most competitive. I think the third is stature. Mexico's ability to implement these reforms, I think, will give it stature from the transparency, from the agility, from the openness, from the market competitiveness. That has credit on the international stage. And finally, to be a strategic supplier by 2025 as non-OPEC production peaks. Mexican production, if all goes well, will begin to come on board. All these deep water fields will take 10 years, 2023, 2024, 2025. That's when non-OPEC peaks, and so Mexico could take that place and be very strategic. So we call this report Energy Reform at Last, ? Because these reforms, as impressive as they are necessary but not a sufficient condition to create these reforms. You've got to have the legislation and regulation. You've got to have the terms to see what you can book, how competitive they are, and some speed. But we also call it Mexico Rising, because there's no question that while the road here to implement this will be bumpy, there's no turning back now. The government has made this commitment. And so it's a remarkable accomplishment, and I can only say that, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary, we wish you well in completing it. Thank you.
Thank you. They're going to put some extra chairs up here, and I'd like to invite the panelists and Enrique to come back up.
Después del litigio también.
Great. Please. Why don't I take the furthest away, and Mr. Secretary?
Okay.
David, Jorge, Duncan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So again, I'm Peter Schechter, the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming, Enrique and David. Thanks for the fascinating presentations. Last week, I was reprimanded in an interview by a journalist for being too enthusiastic about what Mexico has done. So to my panelists, that's a warning, because I'm going to try to redeem myself in trying to be very overly severe. I'm going to try to center my questions on three principal areas, which is the mechanics of the reform, the business implications of the reform, and then what are the implications for Mexico and Mexico's future. And I'm not an energy expert. I'm just the local, commonly found Washington policy civilian. So let me start with Duncan and ask him for his comments. But I'd love you if you could place those comments within the context of what is this going to mean for a new North American revival, in particular in the energy industry, but given, as we've heard, that NAFTA is now just coming on to its 20 years, what is NAFTA 2.0, and how does this energy reform fit in that?
Thanks,
Duncan.
Peter. And thanks for inviting me today. First of all, I would echo the sentiments that have been expressed already. This is a paradigm shift. For those of us who have been engaged in Mexican energy policy work for a number of years, I remember I fell into it almost by accident back in 2005. And it actually emerged at a meeting at the ITAM in Mexico City. We were talking about the future of North America. And the one question that kept coming up was, so what do we do with energy? And remember, the situation was very, very different back in 2005, 2006. The big concern in the United States was energy security. The big concern was, where are we going to find the energy, the oil and gas that we need to really power our economy? Fast forward 8 years, and we're in a very, very different situation. The United States is now in a situation where it's looking at regional energy or North American energy independence or autonomy. It's looking at a situation where it's been through and going through the shale and tight oil revolution and feels much more secure about itself. I think this is a very, very important dimension in understanding the way in which this reform in Mexico is being received in the United States. There's a big difference. If you talk to people in Houston, you see enormous excitement about the business opportunities that are there. You speak to people in Washington and say, that's great, we're really happy for you guys. Which is very different to how it was back in 2005. Or even in 2008, when the last attempt to bring energy reform was put on the table and ultimately failed. North America at this point in time, I think, is in a much, much better situation than it has been in the past. And Mexico's reform is kind of like the icing on the cake, because it means that we're now going to see potentially another 1 million barrels of oil production per day being added by 2025. I would actually put it a little bit later than that. We're going to see, hopefully, rising levels of natural gas production. And we're going to see the possibility, and I think this is the key point, more than just production figures and reserves, we see the potential now for real energy market integration in North America. And it touches on many of the things that Enrique already pointed to, which is that we need to guarantee not just supply, but stability of supply of energy for the producers of North America. We need to keep energy costs low in the United States and in Canada, and we need to lower them significantly in Mexico. Partially that's for competitiveness, and partially it's because people need it. I mean, some people in Mexico spend up to 1/3 of their income on their electricity bill every month. I mean, even in the north of the country. We need to lower those electricity costs for social purposes as well. And I think that the energy reform that we've seen go through the Congress right now is something that really offers that possibility. So I think it's a game changer. As David has said, there's still a lot of work to go to happen. And in the first 120 days of next year, we're going to see that. And just as a thing, Enrique, I know you graduated from the ITAM 1997, something like that. And I was there then, and I don't know if the rector of ITAM, Arturo Fernandez, gave the same speech that he always gives at the graduation ceremony. I had to hear it like 34 times in my time that I was there as a director of program. But he always said this, he said, you know, felicidades a todos los graduados, hoy empiezan los verdaderos exámenes de la vida. And I think that this moment in time for Mexico is like that. We're celebrating a graduation. It's moving forward. It's moving on to the next stage of life. But the real exams are going to begin now. There's so much work to do. And that's why I think it's so important that we keep our focus on the oil and gas sector, and particularly on many of the questions that David brought up earlier on.
Thank you. Well, that's a great segue for my question for Jorge, because while he comes from Austin with a very academic hat on now, it's certainly not where he spent most of his life, because you're the only one on this panel who actually was an oil executive. So, and in Mexico. So talk to us a little bit about what is going through an energy executive's mind right now, and how is this seen to him as a game changer, and how does a Spanish, French, or U.S. energy executive choose between now Mexico or Angola or Trinidad or Kurdistan?
Sure.
What goes through an executive's head?
First of all, thank you for the Atlantic Council, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. You know, just like in your example, in business, sometimes the easiest thing to set up is the strategic plan. The tough part is the business plan to implement that strategic vision. That's the toughest part. So I think all of us have talked through the challenges that we are facing. I hate to say it, but maybe this was the easiest part of the whole energy reform part. And still, because of all these raised expectations, I think there's a tough road ahead. I certainly don't represent the industry, but after working in the energy sector, in the oil sector for 34 years, 5 of those as in Mexico City, I want to basically focus my comments on 3 areas, and then that way we can get some conversation from the audience. I want to talk about Pemex. Pemex is not going away. Okay? Pemex is also not going to be privatized. I don't like the word privatization. I prefer the word recapitalization. Pemex hopefully someday will become a Petrobras and an Ecopetrol in which private capital can participate in the growth of what is going to be an extremely important company such as Pemex. So forget about the privatization of Pemex. Hopefully what we'll see in the future is the recapitalization of Pemex. But we have to be sure that Pemex is able to compete in this new world. Pemex cannot take and play a very important role in this whole process if it has one hand tied behind its back. I am extremely pleased as an academic that about 10%, if not more, of the fund that is going to go to STEM education and technology and sciences, that is extremely important. That's one of the areas, as Secretary Alcocer we know is very interested in. Pemex is going to go through what I consider a very important brain drain. As all of these new companies come into Mexico to operate, let me assure you that a lot of the technicians, a lot of the geologists, a lot of the petroleum engineers are going to come from Pemex. In other words, a lot of these companies are going to hire folks from Pemex. Pemex also, in the next 5 years, faces a huge retirement vacuum. A lot of petroleum engineers and geologists, many of them from UT Austin, are about to retire in the next 3 to 5 years. So there's a huge technical knowledge-based challenge that Pemex is going to face. The most important thing for Pemex to change is the culture of the company. It is not the technical expertise of its employees and its engineers and its geologists. It's the culture of entrepreneurship, and it's the culture that a company learns in the oil business when we become international. Today, for example, Ecopetrol has joint ventures in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico with Shell. Ecopetrol is doing that not only hopefully because it'll make money with Shell in the Gulf of Mexico, but because it's learning along with Shell on how to develop its deep water resources like Colombia is going to begin doing in the deep waters of the Caribbean. So it is very important that the re-engineering of Pemex also becomes a very important piece of this energy reform. My other comment that we're going to be looking at from, I think, the oil company's point of view is the downstream sector. Pemex, as it was put on shown here, there's about 2 million barrels a day of demand. There's about 1.6 million barrels a day of what we call boilerplate refinery capacity, but there's only about 1.2 of that capacity that is really operable capacity. Therefore, that huge gap of over 600,000 barrels a day of imports, not only of gas, of refined products, but also of natural gas, at a value of over $20 billion a year deficit is what the imports of refined products and gas. So that's an issue that also has to be addressed. The refinery in Tula, the new refinery in Tula, about a $10, $12 billion project, has been tabled. But I think the refining sector is going to be extremely important in Mexico. We're going to see if Pemex can do joint ventures in the U.S. with U.S. refineries. It takes anywhere between 3 to 7 years to build a whole refinery system. So maybe there's some joint ventures possibility in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. Last, and I think it's very important, is offshore safety. We were recently in a meeting in Tampa talking about offshore safety in the Gulf of Mexico. We were very pleased to see that CENER was there. CENER had a very important presence in that meeting because as Mexico now begins to drill, we already have the Pegasus, we already have the Bicentenario, we have at least 3 semi-submersibles that are already drilling about 30 miles south of the U.S. maritime border on the Perdido area. What happens and how are we going to manage a catastrophic event like the Deepwater Horizon in Mexican waters? We do have the Mexus agreement. It's a very good basic agreement between the United States and Mexico on how to handle, from a technical point of view, a major transboundary event like this. But those of us that went through the Deepwater Horizon incident know how difficult it is to manage such an event. So I think that offshore safety is something also, Peter, that not only the industry, but also the United States government and others should be very concerned with.
Jorge, thank you. Let me just ask Enrique, who I know may have some issues with Jorge's statement that it was so easy to get this done over the last couple. But let me look towards the future and ask you a little bit about managing expectations in Mexico. I mean, it's you know, this reform promises a lot, but a lot won't come so quickly. And so now polls are saying that the reform is not that popular. The economy is yet to take off in a very definitive way. How does the president show benefits? How do you manage expectations? How do you keep going in this political part? Because as you try to fix the policy, you need to keep the politics right.
That's a very interesting and fair question. But first, let me take on the fact that this was very easy.
I had a feeling you might want us to comment on that.
It was the easy part. I'm looking forward for the difficult part. Let's see how that plays out. But it's really an achievement of the country because 4 important political parties approved the reform. It has passed swiftly in over 20 state legislatures. And I think that shows President Enrique Peña's leadership. Now, with the polls, in many important issues in public policy, what type of questions you ask? If you describe the benefits of a reform of this type, the majority of the people are in favor of paying lower costs in electricity or in gas. If you ask if you want to privatize Pemex, high response of no. But this reform is not privatizing Pemex, and this reform is aimed to produce more natural gas in Mexico, and that will decrease the costs and decrease the cost of electricity through the process that we have discussed before. So I believe that this reform, as it evolves, it will show the benefits to the Mexican people. We have also been very careful, following the instruction of the president, not to establish a timeline that it's not going to be achievable. We believe that as David's study describes accurately, that it's going to take time. And the constitutional reform establishes already a timeline, and we're going to follow it. It's around zero for Pemex first, then we can migrate from those contracts from those entitlements to new contracts, pending of secondary legislation that shall be put into discussion in Congress on the next period. So once Congress approves the secondary legislation, then we're looking for a one-year period of time for Pemex to get its round zero and its transition to contracts. We will see up to 2 years for the first bidding round. As you said, around 2016, we might be around that time, and 2015, 2016. And as many of the specialists that are here with us today know, well, the implementation of such reforms in Brazil and in Colombia took time. And we are fully aware of that. Now, we also believe that there are some fields that will benefit from this type of new contracts sooner than others. Shale gas and shale oil in the northern part of the country, or shallow water or brown fields in Pemex will show an increase in production earlier than deep water and ultra deep water in the Gulf of Mexico. So we will see some benefits coming in. We are estimating that our oil production will increase from the 2.5 million barrels per day that we have now to around 3 million barrels per day by 2018 and to 3.5 by 2025. We believe that's a fair estimate. We also believe that an increase in production of natural gas from the 5,700 million cubic feet that we produce today to around 8,000 by the end of this administration, 2018, and to 10,400 around 2025, which will allow us to reduce our imports substantially from the US and decrease the costs of gas and electricity. So we believe that those numbers are there. If you go to numbers of foreign direct investment, we have seen many of the companies that have made those estimates show that around $10 billion by the end of 2018 of foreign direct investment in the sector. We believe that that's fair. That's an increase by 50% of what the foreign direct investment in Mexico is today. So that is a huge jump if we achieve that number by 2018. But those are estimates from private sector think tanks. Now, on jobs, we believe that we will increase by 500,000 new jobs by 2018, over 2.5 million jobs by 2025. So those are the estimates that we have put forward to the Mexican people, and we believe this is obviously something that we will achieve in the middle range and long range, and we don't think that we are going to have something immediate. We think in order to get it right, we need to do it one step at a time, and we're committed to do it that way.
So David, let me ask you, I mean, I think Enrique's just outlined sort of where we are. Now, fill in for us, for the civilian like me, how do I measure progress along that road? What are the milestones that we should all be looking for, that this is going in the right direction, that this is on time, that we're heading in? And as you do that, who's done this really well? And what example should we compare Mexico to as a little bit the best case scenario?
Sure, thanks. Well, I have 4 bellwethers that I guess I would watch in the next 6 months. The first is legislation. I think the Mexican government has already prepared drafts of legislation for implementation, but we'll really need to see, what do these frameworks look like? What do we know about the terms? How predictable will it be? So legislation is the first benchmark. The second is going to be budget, because if the CNH gets a significant budget allocation so that it can buy seismic, if we see that the agencies are funded so they can hire outside help to be able to stand up the safety rules or the environmental rules or even the licensing requirements, then we're going to see that, we can predict, I guess, that the regulators are going to be in a position to move swiftly when the time comes. The third actually is that outsourcing, and particularly in the power sector, you're going to need a lot more information about the nature of distribution, about whether there's metering at the houses, what are the size of the load centers, what do we know about the quality of transmission. That information is going to have to be organized, synthesized, in a sense, presented for investors in a way that they can understand. So I'd be watching, is there budget and is there new help that's on there? And fourth would be leadership. Are we going to see shadow leaders of these efforts? You know, post-Macondo, President Obama brought in Mike Bromwich, and it's like, this is the guy who's going to fix this, and he's got this big mandate, and come back in 6 months, and we'll tell you what this looks like. So we should start to see shadow leaders for the safety effort, for the environmental effort. There's maybe plussing up the leadership. So I think those are the 4 bellwethers for me. In terms of who's done this, Brazil did it right the first time. but then their second reform has taken it back. So I would say the opening to the upstream, Norway, Brazil have followed that model. The transparency of the bid process, I think the U.S. and Norway have done it, but Algeria did it, Iraq did it, Libya did it. The system of open criteria, you open the envelope, you see who wins. The independence of the regulators. I think it remains to be seen whether they're going to be safety case or performance standards or what kind of regulators they're going to be. But I think Norway is another great example. Brazil is a great example. Colombia has a terrific regulator. Those are other countries that have done this well. And on the fund, I think it's pretty much only Norway that has done this with the kind of political independence, fiscal independence that Mexico has.
Peter, can I just come in here?
Absolutely,
I think it's worth spending a moment to talk about the regulator because that's the key element right now, I think, in this. And the question that a lot of us have is, we have a very small, underfunded National Hydrocarbons Commission at this point in time. And in a relatively short period of time, we're expecting them to either find the human capital and the resources in Mexico or bring them in from outside. And that's the real danger, I think, here. And David said it very, very well. Is the Commission going to be allowed to recruit internationally? Will it have the resources to do it? Is it going to be an attractive enough proposition? Because if it's not a strong, autonomous regulator, then this will be a real problem for both companies wanting to invest in Mexico and for the benefits that will be distributed to the Mexican people.
And what role, Jorge, can institutions like yours, University of Texas, play in cooperating with some of the technical assistance that Duncan was just talking about?
I think it's not only the University of Texas at Austin, but I think there's a lot of universities in the United States that have a long relationship with Mexico and with Pemex and so on. We have numbers of we're working now with a group in Mexico on shale gas development. We were just talking about water resources along the border and what impact the shale development could have to water resources. So certainly our universities alone, by the way, in partnerships which we have with UNAM, with El Politécnico, with CONACYT and the National Science Foundation, the resources are there for us on our side of the business, again, the academic and research side of the business, to add value to this whole process. And remember, there's a heavy involvement in research and partnerships in the American universities with the private sector. So yes, there's no question that U.S. institutions, academic institutions, and in cooperation and partnership with Mexican institutions can play a key role in this whole process.
That's great. Please.
May I just comment? This is a very important issue, the independence and the well-funded of the regulators. And the constitutional reform has taken notice of this. One of the strong elements of the reform is that in Article 28 of the Constitution, both regulators, the upstream regulator and the downstream regulator, had achieved some sort of constitutional status. And they have granted technical autonomy and operative autonomy. And they have granted something called budget autosuficiencia presupuestaria. So what does this mean? This means that for the services that they provide, they collect a fee. Up to now, that fee would go to the Ministry of Finance and into the budget. So they wouldn't be allowed to keep that fee. Now, they will allow to keep that fee, and they will be allowed to have it in a fideicomiso. It's a trust account. A trust account. A trust
account, yeah.
In a trust account up to 3 years of their yearly budget. So that means that they will have a trust account for over almost 3 years of what their budget is like. So they will have enough resources that will be provided by their own services to be able to do all these type of things. Now, it's mostly auto-regulated by Pemex into a system that will be regulated by others. Mm-hmm. So we are migrating into that, and we are fully aware that we have to be very careful into that implementation. Now, in addition to that, there are going to be 2 new members for each of these regulators. There are right now a 5-member regulator board. Now they're going to be a 7-member regulator board. This is also due to the increase in the workload. So we believe that they're going to have the personnel, the budget, and the autonomy to be able to to be the fundamental part of the new model that we have achieved in the constitutional amendment.
All of you have mentioned the word transparency in your remarks, in your comments. And clearly the reform aims to turn a page. And how does the Mexican government now sort of guarantee that transparency, particularly in light of Pemex eventually becoming more independent? But how does Pemex stay and prove its independence from the very beginning? I mean, what are the steps of transparency, really concrete steps that people ought to be looking for and that one would expect the government to take? Let me begin with Duncan. It's a question for all of you.
Yeah, I mean, the first step, I think, is to really learn what best practices are out there in the world. The second thing is to take full advantage of the technologies that we have available to us. Enrique gave us a very nice rundown of how transparency will work its way through in each of the bidding rounds and the payments, et cetera, et cetera. That information needs to be publicly available online and easily accessible. It shouldn't be hidden behind, various different hurdles that you have to get over. And the third thing I would say is that industry needs to play a role in making sure that things remain open. And let's face it, the international oil industry, whilst historically has not been the most transparent industry, in recent years has begun to pick up and to realize that transparency actually works in their favor. And fourthly, I would say that civil society needs to play a very big role in Mexico, and that the government should work with civil society, working with think tanks, et cetera, to make sure that this data is available to the public.
I think the role of the industry, by the way, has changed considerably in the last 20, 50 years. And I think we do welcome transparency. We do welcome also good governance. We have many countries in the world, which I'm not going to mention, in which we have huge challenges because there's a lot of things that we would like to implement that is part of the corporate core, of the corporate belief of not only the corporation but our shareholders. And in some countries, it's extremely difficult to implement. So I think transparency, not only, yes, from the industry is welcome, but I think also transparency in the whole process is welcome. There's a lot of data, both seismic data. There's a lot of different data that we do have to share now. We have consortiums, talking about universities. We have consortiums in our university in which 5 or 6 different private companies participate in that consortium. And they share knowledge, and they share new licenses and new procedures. And so transparency is extremely important, but good governance within the country in which we operate is extremely important. And I think that's going to be the case in Mexico, by the way. I don't have any question, having lived there and having traveled there for the last 5 or 6 years regularly, that there's a culture change, that there is a new re-engineering not only of Pemex, but there is a new re-engineering of Mexican society. We have to be, by the way, I did not mean that the reform process was easy. Folks have to understand. I did say that, yes, but I didn't mean that.
You didn't mean it.
I didn't mean that. People have to understand. People have to. The first thing that when I was sent to Mexico, believe it or not, my corporation sent me for a 3-week course. Even though I have a degree in Latin American studies, on Mexican history. And you have to go back to Mexican-American War of 1847-48. People forget that the U.S. Marines were in the port of Veracruz in 1914. There's history behind this whole culture that also then comes and ties to March of 1938 that we have to understand. The political and historical courage that it took the administration of President Peña Nieto to move this reform forward. So yes, even though from a historical political context, the process was difficult and not easy, what I meant to say that from a business point of view, this is the easy part. Now comes the implementation so we can get to those targets that we're looking at for 2016 and 2020.
I just add really quickly, Peter, that it's really remarkable that at the constitutional level, people have to appreciate these transitory articles have constitutional status, that revenue transparency, contract transparency, cost reporting transparency, and reporting of the distributions of the National Fund are all basically commanded at the constitutional level. I mean, I don't think there's another country in the world that has a constitutional level directive for transparency. So that's pretty impressive. I think smaller steps that'll be important will be looking what the auction system looks like. Presumably that will be transparent. And joining something like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative will give a platform for civil society to participate. And that's been a popular international movement that's shown some good results.
Enrique, let me give you the last word before I open up to questions from.
Well, there's a full commitment in transparency in the Peña Nieto's administration. What you have said is true. We went to different countries to see how the different oil models work, and we learned from those who have transparency elements that have worked well, and we have put them into the Constitution so that we can have a mandate, a very clear mandate to make them enforceable in the law and in the regulatory next steps. So we're fully committed, and I think that most importantly, the Mexican people is not satisfied with the way transparency has been dealt with the extractive sector in the past, and we need to do it better. So that's strong motivation, and we hope that civil society will be highly involved in that. And the idea of EITI is very, very important. We're analyzing it to do it promptly.
Thank you. So I'd like to bring all of our other guests here. And sir, why don't I begin with you, because I see you're closest.
Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Thank you all very much. There's, perhaps it's on purpose, but there's some ambiguity about the issue of booking reserves. And David, in the paper, says it's clear that it's the intention to allow companies to be able to benefit from the future value of what they're doing. But I haven't heard you quite say that. Would you tell us how the government of Mexico and CENER views this going forward? Because that really is the fundamental issue.
For us, is what Congress has achieved in the Constitution, we believe is standard practice. Of course, in the contracts, it has to be established that the property of oil and gas in the subsoil is of the Mexican nation, but those contracts shall also be available to be able to report the future benefits, the future economic benefits of those contracts, fulfilling all the legal requests that the companies have in different markets. So we are, according to standard international practices, that's how we see that transitory article.
I would just add, Stephen, that the SEC ultimately will want to look at the contracts and see is there an element of risk and is there a security of entitlement. And if they see those two in the forms of the contracts, then they will make a determination that those reserves are able to be booked by companies. I would say that in terms of the political culture, from both talking to our colleagues here and talking to some of the opposition parties, and appreciating that the threshold for legislation is lower than the threshold for constitutional reform, the entire initiative makes no sense absent the ability of companies to book reserves. I think there is deep knowledge and recognition on the part of the government that if companies cannot book reserves, then they will not invest, and they wouldn't have gone to all this effort to try and force this constitutional change, and knowing it would take constitutional change without it. But you got to see the contracts, and I think in the legislation, that's the two big bellwethers, I think, are going to be how much the definition of the schemes is defined in the legislation and how much visibility there is on the terms. Because they're all these companies have their models and they crunch it in, how much they're going to spend and what's the return on investment, and that's why they'll pick Mexico, not Kurdistan or some other place. And so the earlier we see that visibility, the more security there'll be.
Kirk Schur with Clearview Strategy. My question is about national content and what the thinking is around national content. Obviously, that's been a big issue in the hemisphere, and the extent to which Mexico deals with the national content issue will put it either more competitive versus other options or less competitive versus other options in the hemisphere.
Can I take that?
Please.
Yes, one of the constitutional transitory articles establishes that in secondary law, we will establish the percentages, the areas, and the time frame for national content. What we have learned in other countries is that it is important to one of the outcomes of a reform of this type is to have a strong national industry that produces services and participates actively in that transformation of the oil and gas sector in the country. And we're aiming to that. But it will be in the secondary legislation that we will establish the guideline. We're also aware that some of the examples in other countries have been that if you put such strict rules into a national context, that has slowed down the implementation of the reform, or that has made them more expensive in its process of implementation. And another strong element is that we're very interested in establishing foreign direct investment. We're looking for companies that are right now based in the US that will be able to be based in Mexico and have important offices and produce products there in Mexico in order to bring them, instead of buying their products from the US, to be able to buy the products from Mexico. And Brazil has been very successful at achieving that. And Norway has been very successful at achieving that. Its own private sector has become a worldwide producer of services in the oil and gas sector. So we're aiming at that. We're also aware that we have commitments in different free trade agreements that establish that we have to have equal treatment of investment. So in order to craft the secondary legislation, we have these three elements to put into place in a correct way.
I just wanted to mention that as we're sitting here today, there are a number of Mexican companies today in Houston already talking to U.S. companies, particularly service, contract, and petroleum services companies. So it's not only foreign investment from the point of view of American company dollars going, but I think Mexican companies are going to come over here, do joint ventures with U.S. corporations, have that knowledge transfer, that skill transfer, and you're going to see in the next 5 years a very considerable number of very good quality Mexican companies that are going to be the future of this industry. So from a local content point of view, I think the Mexico case is going to be different, certainly, than the Brazilian case. In fact, somebody asked the question about NAFTA. I think this is an area in which now the NAFTA infrastructure is going to help this new relationship between Mexican small companies, medium-sized companies, small companies that provide services and equipment and products to the oil and gas industry in Mexico, doing joint venture with the U.S. That to me is a huge area of growth, by the way.
Just one thing, I think it's important to remember that we sit here in Washington or in Houston and we look and we say we don't want the national content requirements to be too high because that will be a barrier to investment. But we also don't want them to be too low, because part of this goal is, this is not just about oil and gas, it's not just about electricity, it's about actually developing the Mexican economy, it's about increasing competitiveness and adding jobs ultimately. And if we want this reform to be politically sustainable in the long term, the Mexican people need to feel a benefit from it. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon both business and government right now to work together to work out exactly what would be a fair level for national or local content. And then for the government and Pemex in particular to work with local providers throughout the country to actually develop national indigenous capacity to do this, because that's where the long-term benefits of this reform will really be felt.
Absolutely. The back of the room, sir. Right. The gentleman who's standing. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. First of all, Undersecretary Ochoa, thank you for coming up to Washington, and thank you for your PowerPoint presentation, which I hope the Atlantic Council will place on their website. My question concerns the valuation of the blocks. Prior to an auction on international market prices, who will determine the valuation of existing fields, and what are the criteria which will be used to determine their value?
Thank you very much, Ms. Negroponte. I will leave the presentation, obviously, to the Atlantic Council, and thank you very much for having me. The Ministry of Energy will make that economic balance with information from the National Hydrocarbons Commission. And the Ministry of Finance will make the fiscal calibration of the contract in itself. And then the bidding process will be taken up by the National Hydrocarbons Commission, who will announce the winner and sign the contract on behalf of the Mexican state. But yeah, the secondary legislation will establish the framework through which we will do those economic analyses. But the industry will require case-by-case analysis, because the fields from shale water to shale gas or ultra-deep waters, the economic conditions are very different. So we will allow secondary legislation to establish a framework, but it will be up to the Ministry of Energy on its responsibilities and the Ministry of Finance on its responsibilities to tune in each contract depending on the quality of the field. Thank you.
I would just say this is an area of risk, I think. To take an area, say shale fields or deep water, and say this is this framework or frameworks that we're going to apply, and these are roughly the terms, to scale a lot of acreage at one time for auction, where the market will determine the price. But if it's field by field, that creates, I think, a significant drag on the bureaucratic process and the ability to really slow down. Why is one field versus another one under certain terms? I think then you run into problems of, is that being done because it's a way of getting Pemex to be able to get some preferential rights, and I know that's not the design. So I think that's something to watch in that process, is what's the most efficient way to get those blocks sized and get them up for auction, and how much flexibility will there be for companies which may see higher risk in shale gas than they see in other areas because of the costs, to lean towards a concession versus, say, profit sharing.
Let me ask the same best practice example. Who has done the acreage valuation correctly?
Well, actually, we've done it pretty well. I would say, at least in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico. I mean, Jorge would agree. We have, we run the seismic, we do a geologic assessment, we make that data available, and then it goes up for auction. So the market determines the price. In times when we have seen high risk, like in shale gas, but also in the deepwater in 1998 when prices were $10, we provided tax incentives to encourage people to go into the shale business and to go into the deepwater. And both of those incentives expired once we did that, but that was basically, we saw an area wanted to maximize the reward, but we did it by area, by type of geology, rather than by field. I think the Norwegians do something similar. Even the UK, has another one for deep water, but it's for marginal fields generally. It's not field by field assessment. And I think it makes it's easier bureaucratically on the licensing agency, but it's also much more predictable.
Legislation allows for variation, which is important, no?
Yes, among different types of geology.
Correct. Yeah. Deep water versus shale, for example.
So we're following that path. First, variation allowed by the secondary legislation, and then we'll go that.
The gentleman in the back, I know, has been waiting a couple.
Thank you. Thank you, Subsecretary Ochoa, for being here. My name is Ivana Redondo from the George Washington University. Mr. Duncan Wood mentioned about the prices of electricity in Mexico being a little bit too high, especially in the northern part. I'm a witness of this. Even though production will open up and production costs will lower down because of the openness, distribution in electricity and gasoline will still, and electricity is still controlled by a national company. What opportunities will be there? Is this even considered about opening up the national company, and what opportunities could be there for business?
Thank you. That's a very good question. The other part of the energy reform is a strong transformation in the electricity sector. This is not my field, but let me just give you some of the important lines of this reform. Transmission and distribution are natural monopolies. So the way that this reform allows private participation is through contracts with CFE, the national power company. And this is in the way that the Brazilians did their own transformation, that allowed the public company to establish contracts that will allow to build new transmission and distribution lines. Now, have in mind that 80% of the price of electricity comes from the cost of the fuel that you use to produce electricity. So there's a big opportunity there for natural gas to have an impact in the whole area. Now, the other important part in Mexico is an inefficient distribution system where we're losing around 20% of the electricity that we conduct. And this is due to technical failures, and in some areas it's more like social problems that have been introduced in people not paying or people stealing the electricity. So through these contracts, we will find a mechanism to make those lines more efficient. But if you see the percentage of the impact, having a market substantial natural gas and renewables that can put a mix of the production of electricity in a way that will tend the costs to go down significantly. And if that's 80% of the cost of electricity, then we can translate to the consumer better prices of electricity to make it more competitive with the region. So we hope to go that way. But it is a huge transformation as well, and I would suggest that you can invite Undersecretary Lourdes Melgar, who is the Undersecretary for Electricity, in January. And the reform is very big, very important. And in the press, because it was an easy reform, it got to a secondary position. But the hydrocarbons have taken much more of the attention. But electricity reform is very important too.
Okay. Please transmit to the Undersecretary that the floor is open for David. I know there's a section of the report on electricity. Do you want to summarize that?
Yes, and Undersecretary Melgar is well known here in Washington. We'd be delighted to have her here. I think that this is an area where there's great opportunity, but the framework makes all the difference. It may be that in Mexico, that distributed generation is going to be the first area of commercial opportunity rather than grid extension. Places where people can have relatively small sources of generation, access their own gas, and provide electricity to something other than the major load centers. And so there needs to be visibility and flexibility in the legislation to allow those relatively smaller generators to be able to sell directly to customers. Relying on CFE for collections when collections are not good, and relying on CFE for transmission sort of security when transmission is already weak will be a source of insecurity for investors. So some flexibility there would be helpful. Subsidy, I think, is the other question there, because as long as residential consumers are subsidized, then really the target is going to be the industrial consumers, the ones who are producing a lot of their own electricity. And to create a system where you can extend transmission and where you can bring in all this capital, at some point you're going to have to open up the residential base. And no one is going to be able to provide electricity cheaper than an existing subsidized system. So that's, I think in the initial drafts of the reform, there had been a transitory amendment which called for moving from general subsidies to targeted subsidies, which would be classic economic theory. Right now, everybody in Mexico City gets their first 250 kilowatts of electricity free, whether you're Carlos Slim or whether you need some income subsidy from the government. That's a very expensive and inefficient system. So maybe in the secondary legislation, there'll be another opportunity to take a look at that. But that's, we say the value proposition is a question. And it's those kinds of questions, both the data and the framework, which I think still have to be worked out.
I saw Duncan nod when the word subsidy was mentioned.
I mean, as many of you in the room know, it's a bizarre pricing system in Mexico. It really, really is. And some people end up paying very little. Some people, when you jump over the sort of the barrier in terms of your residential consumption, all of a sudden the cost of every single unit of electricity that you've consumed goes up enormously. And so working out how to remove subsidies, but at the same time lowering energy costs, I think, is part of the conundrum that we're looking at right now. And it's very, very important in political terms, because this is where the average Mexican, I think, is going to feel the benefits of the energy reform. Yes, we can talk about jobs and competitiveness and all the other great things, but your average Mexican on the street wants to see that the promise of lower energy costs and lower fuel costs as well really come through within a reasonable period of time. And I'm a believer, I'm an optimist on this, that once you have a greater participation by private generators in the system, and once you bring in these lower costs of natural gas for combined cycle generation, which doesn't necessarily need to happen because of the reform, it could happen just by building the pipelines across the border to get the gas into the market, that I think we will begin to feel those benefits anyway.
Thank you. Another question, we're willing to take questions from the web as well. Sir.
Hi, Jeff Epping with Energies LLC. I've had the good fortune, I worked for Pemex for a couple of years, and I've looked at hundreds of wells and kilometers of seismic, and the geologic potential is very good, and I think you'll generate tremendous interest. My question is, turning the issue of security for operations, how do you think that will play out for drilling wells, especially onshore?
Thank you very much. One of the elements of the constitutional reform is that a new institution is going to be created to overlook industrial safety and environmental issues, which is going to be dependent of the Ministry of Environment. And that institution was created thinking about the important issues that you were saying. Up to today, Pemex self-regulates. It's a self-regulatory institution regarding those topics. If an accident if an accident happens, then they have to make a report to the Ministry of Energy. That system has to evolve into something that includes a new institution, and it also will have the participation of the Ministry of Energy, but the new institution will take care of that.
I would just add, I mean, the U.S.-Mexico Transboundary Agreement finally cleared the U.S. Congress as part of the budget deal. And I think at the time when I was at the State Department, we were launching that, we thought that was going to be just a first baby step to cooperate with Mexico on safety in the Gulf of Mexico. Now it turns out we've leapfrogged that pretty completely. But I think this would be a ripe area for U.S.-Mexico cooperation, because we have certainly learned a lot about safety, and at least in the deep water, oil spill prevention, oil spill mechanisms, commercially available systems. So I think that's one of the areas over the next months where we could have some bilateral and hemispheric cooperation as well.
And that's something that we talked about, and I just want to underscore that process is already in place, and that process already has been in place before this energy reform. In other words, there is great cooperation between the U.S. and the Mexican Coast Guard. There is cooperation and work between CENER and the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Coast Guard, private industry. And as I said, just recently, as in November, there was a meeting in Tampa in which Mexican officials and U.S. Coast Guard officials were there. So the process is in place. All that I wanted to underscore and highlight, again, through maybe saying that everything in this world is easy as far as the agreements and the paperwork is concerned, implementation is a very, very difficult challenge. And the Deepwater Horizon taught us that. I think that in this new concept, by the industry being able to work hand in hand with Pemex, that's going to bring and transfer a lot of knowledge on how we manage the business. So I think that's an area that we're going to see quite a bit of improvement. By the way, not only in offshore drilling, but also in pipeline transportation. We have seen a number of accidents and incidents in Mexico, and also in onshore field work.
I don't know if this was implicit in your question, but the public security onshore in particular, because I don't think we're going to see the Zetas going out into the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But it's a question that I get asked a lot, and my standard response is, look at where the international oil industry operates globally. They don't always operate in exactly the safest places. They know how to deal with security threats. The one potential exception, I would say, is the smaller operators that might benefit from a boom in the shale business in northern Mexico. That's where we really have to keep focused on the questions of rule of law in Mexico, where we have to keep focused on trying to lower levels of violence across the country. And in particular, lowering the cost of doing business, because although it hasn't been a significant disincentive for investment in Mexico in recent years, it does raise the cost of doing business when you have to face threats of kidnapping, extortion, etc. And for the bigger companies, that's not a big deal. For the smaller companies, I think that's something they need to factor in.
Good morning, Remy Enkens from WBI. Let me come back to the electricity sector. Do you see a role for the World Bank, like the AFC or the public branch of the World Bank, or the IDB in opening up the sector to private participation?
Not that I am aware of. The transformation in the reform is that it will allow something that happened since Mexico amended its secondary legislation in 1995, in 1991 and 1992, which was to allow participation of private sectors in generation for consumption of its own and to sell it to nearby big businesses. And that model has been put into question because it was not a constitutional amendment. There has been several intents to amend the Constitution in order to put this model into place, but until now it has been successful. So what we are doing now is establishing something that is already there. A third of Mexico's power production is done by the private sector. But now what we are achieving with this reform is not only that they have a constitutional base to do so, but we're also promoting a market so that we can have the lowest cost producers to be distributed first. And that will be one of the substantial reasons why we can decrease prices in the future, because if we have a strong supply of natural gas in the country, that will decrease the costs of production of electricity in Mexico. And if we have an independent body that will submit the electricity to the distribution lines according to lower cost, that could be able to transfer these benefits to the overall population. Of course, there is a task ahead to get the subsidies system right in order to decrease externalities that you have, that Duncan and Jorge have described. But this is part of a whole plan of implementation that will allow the lower costs of production of electricity to reach the bill of the Mexicans.
There's one area that let me, how about product branding in retail? In other words, all of the service stations in Mexico are not owned by Pemex. They're privately owned by dealers and jobbers and operators, but only carry and buy only product from Pemex. So it's the Pemex brand, Pemex product. In the legislation or in secondary legislation, are we looking at the availability of private branding? That's number one. Is the operator of that private brand going to be able to import then its own gasoline so that therefore the deficit in refining can be met by the operator? Is that model for downstream marketing of retail fuels is somewhere in the vision of the reform?
Yes, yes, of course. And because we have this irony, we already import 50% of our gasoline, but there is no benefits of competition for the consumer. So what we are looking at is precisely in secondary legislation to open up branding and to open up the service. And if that means that the private sector that will do this business needs to import gasoline, well, that's what we are currently doing. We're currently importing 50% of the gasoline. That will be obviously in the process that we can increase the production capacity inside the country. You were mentioning that you could see Pemex having joint ventures in refineries in the US. Well, the irony is that we have them already. Pemex has a refinery in Texas called Deer Park, and it has a joint venture with Shell, and this is from the early 90s. But if Pemex would want to bring its partner Shell to Mexico and do what it's doing in Texas, until the reform, they were forbidden to do so. So that's ironic. You know? You can ask your oil company to do a joint venture in the US, but you forbid your oil company to do it in your country. So with the energy reform that the President Peña put forward in Congress, now Pemex will be allowed to do those joint ventures in Mexico. So we are looking for an important change in downstream. It will take time, as you have described, but we have now the legal structure that will allow those things to happen.
David, you wanted to add something?
Just for the previous questioner, there's always an opportunity for the international financial institutions to provide private financing to IFC, and I think it would be welcome in the power sector. As it turns out now, Pemex is, I think, Exim's #1 customer. The export credit agencies want content, so the European want European content, and the US ones want US content. But I think for the IFC and others, having that participation would probably give comfort to some private investors. So it's probably something for the shareholders of the bank to encourage.
I have a question from those watching us on the web, and I'm going to direct it at Duncan. And the question is, what does this mean for broader U.S.-Mexico relations? And I'm going to add immigration, commerce, judicial cooperation, security cooperation.
Okay. It's a question that I get quite a lot, I have to say. What I think has been fascinating and incredibly well handled by the US government over the last 10 to 15, even 20 years is how the US government has respected Mexico's sovereign right to determine its own energy future. And the role that has been played by the US government. I was actually giving a class yesterday at the Foreign Service Institute, and a Foreign Service officer said to me, was this really the result of great pressure from the United States that the reform happened? And he began to come up with this conspiracy theory that was really bizarre. And I said, hang on a second, you know, this sounds like something from one of my classes in Mexico. This didn't happen. The United States government has always been incredibly respectful in terms of allowing Mexico to determine its own future. And this is the result of a national debate in Mexico and a long process. But the implications of it for the bilateral relationship, I think, are very, very positive, partly because of increased business integration, but mostly the point that I mentioned earlier on, which is increased integration of energy markets, which means that you are seeing an increased integration of the production system in North America. What we're looking at for the future is that all of the three countries of North America depend upon each other to really enhance their competitiveness. And that's what this really opens up a possibility for, is lowering energy costs in Mexico, guaranteeing stability of supply, making sure that US producers in Mexico can stay there because energy costs are lower. And you know, in other areas, you mentioned you know, immigration, security, for example. These are areas where I see that there will be a very positive net benefits for the Mexican people and for the Mexican economy. Already we're seeing zero net migration from Mexico to the United States. And partly that's a result of demographics, partly that's a result of a tougher climate here in the United States, but partly it's as a result of greater economic opportunities in Mexico, and this can only help. Some of the estimates prove to be right about 100,000 new jobs in the energy sector. That's something which we should celebrate, because that means that more 15-year-old Mexicans see that their future is in country as opposed to leaving. And on the point of security, if you are a young man who lives in a marginalized area and you've got no economic opportunities, well, there's very little choices for you. So what are you going to go into? Are you going to migrate, or are you going to go into potentially organized crime? And this offers you another way out. Now, it needs to be added to all of the changes that are happening in education, of course, and other changes in the economy. But I see it as being a very positive thing, and it will relieve a lot of the pressures on the bilateral relationship in the long run.
Particularly in the border states.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
I agree completely.
So somebody, David, let me ask you another question from those watching us on the web. First, the bilateral relationship, but now cast this reform within the TPP that's being negotiated and some of the free trade discussions.
Well, I think for the more Mexico grows as an exporter, probably in oil, gas, may have a lot of a domestic market, the more value there is in TPP. For the United States is in a slightly different position, because for us, the ability to export gas, given the enormous amount of gas we have, the potential to export LNG, and the relatively low prices, that gives us basically something, a bargaining chip to use for both of those trade negotiations, which we didn't have before. So it's indispensable for us. I think Mexico would be sort of a collateral beneficiary of that. I'm not so certain that Mexico is going to become an LNG exporter in the next 10 to 15 years, given the incredible amount of domestic demand and the relatively low price of gas right now. So I'm not so sure that it's as big a deal for Mexico in those trade agreements as it is for us.
Enrique, do you want to add a Mexican view of the bilateral relation?
Sure. I agree that the first objective with a reform of this sort is to have enough oil, natural gas, gasoline, petrochemicals produced in Mexico for our own market. I think that you're right. Mexico will not be an exporter of LNG in the near future. The first task is to reduce the 30% of imports that we have on natural gas, and that will boost a new industrialization of our country and to lower the prices of electricity. But in the long run, and these reforms are made for 50 years, these reforms, obviously, they have impacts in the short term, in the midterm, but mostly in the long term. So I think that we will see a different scenario 10 years ahead of us regarding that. Now, in order for those benefits to come into place, you have to start now. So one of the very important things that we have done the first big step, and we will follow the timeline that the constitutional reform has established, but we have our eyes looking into the future in those fields.
You know, the main thing is we have to look at what's going on in Mexico also from the perspective of North America and the United States. I mean, this is a strategic regional revolution that's going to take place. If you look at the Keystone Pipeline, when and if it gets approved, between the Keystone Pipeline, the Seaway Pipeline, and all of the west, east, and down to the East Coast pipelines that are going to be opened up here in the next few years, the U.S. Gulf Coast refining system is going to have the flexibility and the capacity of at least another 3 million barrels a day of capacity, mainly Canadian crude coming down. So as that Canadian crude comes down, what is it going to displace? What foreign crude coming into the Gulf Coast is going to displace? If it's not going to displace that crude, then I could certainly, if I'm a refiner in the U.S. Gulf Coast, I can certainly tell a Venezuelan or a Colombian or a Mexican importer of crude, now the price differential versus WTI is going to be different because now I have Canadian crude on the pipeline that all I have to do is open the valve. And the same thing with LNG. So I think that what we're talking about is that this Mexican energy reform is really going to open a whole new strategic view of a regional energy matrix that we haven't seen before, that we as a region can certainly take advantage. And I go back to NAFTA. We're talking about Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So I think if politically and economically you guys can get your heads together, certainly from the energy point of view, we can certainly become a power to be. There was a headline yesterday, forgetting one of the news service, about this energy revolution and how we're going to drown in oil because of all the oil that's going to be available. But I think regional integration in North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada is very important for all three economies and also for this reform to move forward.
I mean, if you play this out into the future, I mean, after Mexico meets its domestic demand, what can be interesting for the hemisphere, first is the product trade, I think, because most of U.S. products are now going to the hemisphere. But Central America needs gas. And so if you, depending on how widespread the shale formations are in Mexico, when you meet your demand, you can see 15, 20 years out that Mexico could be a supplier to Central America. And a lot of the problems that we've had so far on fuel oil dependency in the Caribbean and very high carbon consumption in Central America could be resolved by cooperation between Mexico and Central America, or Mexico in the Caribbean. There hasn't been a source close enough, frankly, to some of that territory to be able to get gas to them. Colombia has talked about it, but I think 15 years out, we're probably talking about not only North American, but we're talking about hemispheric energy integration, really at a kind of an unprecedented scale.
All electrical interconnectivity that we've been talking about also in Central America, in which Mexico can certainly play a very important role.
Well, I'm sure could go on for a number of more hours, but I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I really appreciate everybody's participation. An announcement for those members of the press who would like to interview the Undersecretary and some of our guests. If we could meet in the back of this conference room at the end, that would be great. Just an expression of thanks to all of you for participating. It's been an amazing thing to watch in Mexico, not only from a point of view of the technical ability to have passed this reform, but the prowess with which you did it. Not only this reform, I mean, in this past 12 months in Mexico, there has been an education reform, a telecommunications reform, a reform of the financial and tax system, a political reform, and now culminating a year and a couple of days into the first year of President Peña Nieto with with the energy reform. I think you could provide Washington with a Harvard case study about how to get some things done. Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Happy holidays to all of us. Thank you.